Good morning. Back in 1774, Great Britain erected a plaque in the Falkland Islands. The plaque at Port Egmont, at the northwestern point of the archipelago, read as follows: "Be it known to all nations that the Falkland Islands, with this fort, the storehouses, wharfs, harbours, bays, and creeks, thereunto belonging, are the sole right and property of His Most Sacred Majesty George III, King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, Defender of the Faith, etc., etc., etc." The British put up the plaque and left. Today, we're going to take a foray into the turbulent history of these isolated South Atlantic islands that are home to possibly the proudest Brits on the planet. Now, I'm not going to get into why 99.8% of Falkland Islanders voted to remain British in an independence referendum in 2013. And I'm not going to get into why those 3 anonymous dissenters voted against the majority. I don't know the answers to that. I'm just going to tell the story of how these remote islands came to be British and who else has been involved along the way. And yes, just 3 people voted to leave Britain in that UN-backed independence referendum, and they're still trying to work out who the traitors are. Britain isn't the only overseas power interested in the Falklands. Of course, Argentina is the most obvious other country with an interest here, but our story starts earlier than that, with the French, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the Pope. Back in 1493, almost 200 years before the British flag was ever raised in the Falkland Islands, Pope Alexander VI issued a series of papal bulls granting Spain exclusive rights to newly discovered lands west of a conceptual meridian 100 leagues west of the Azores and the Cape Verde Islands. In 1494, Spain and Portugal renegotiated where that line would be, and they signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, which placed the line 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Lands to the east belonged to Portugal, lands to the west belonged to Spain. Now, the Falklands are about 59 degrees west, so they are comfortably west of the Tordesillas line, meaning that they fell under Spanish sovereignty. Not that the Spanish seemed to particularly care until the French arrived. The first Europeans to arrive in the Falkland Islands weren't Spanish, but they were French, led by the explorer Louis de Bougainville. Now, Louis Antoine arrived in 1764 and established a settlement in East Falkland called Port Louis. And before anyone accuses modest Louis Antoine de Bougainville of naming Port Louis after himself, the name was actually chosen in homage to King Louis XV of France. The French royal family loved the name Louis. In total, there were 18 of them. One of them, Louis XIV, was the longest reigning monarch in European history. Another, Louis IX, is the only French monarch to have been sainted. And only one of them was executed. That was Louis XVI in the French Revolution. But anyway, enough about Louis, because as soon as the French moved in and settled Port Louis, the Spanish became very upset. The Pope had been perfectly clear. To the west of the Tordesillas line was Spanish territory, to the east was Portuguese. Did he mention the French? I didn't think so. So, au revoir, monsieur. But Louis XV was a savvy negotiator, and instead of fighting over the territory, which, to be honest, was really cold and stunk of penguin excrement anyway, he decided to sell the settlement to Spain. And it was a very clever deal that made France a total of 618,108 livres, 13 sols, and 11 deniers, the equivalent today of 5.47 million pounds. Pounds being the present-day currency of the Falkland Islands. But wait a minute. Oh, we're a bit behind here. What's going on here? There we go. Isn't this the equivalent of paying your neighborhood burglar to return the TV they stole from your living room? If Spain said that the Falklands were already theirs and France were illegally occupying the territory, why did Spain pay? Well, to get around this legal quagmire, Spain agreed to pay not for the land, but for the expenses that Bougainville had incurred in establishing and supplying the settlement. The settlement that the Spanish quickly rechristened Puerto Soledad. So the Spanish moved in 1767. And they moved into the French-built settlement now known as Puerto Soledad in East Falkland. Now, the Falkland Islands are actually made up of 778 islands in total. But to keep things simple, there are two main islands, known as East Falkland and West Falkland. Now, the total landmass of the islands combined is about 12,173 square kilometers, or about 4,700 square miles. So all in all, the Falkland Islands measure up as just smaller than the state of Connecticut, or the nation of Northern Ireland, to keep the British theme going. And in addition to the two main islands, there are some other notable smaller islands, like New Ireland, which has one of the most spectacular wildlife reserves, Bleaker Island, which is known for its bird-watching opportunities, and Saunders Island, which is where the British first settled in 1765. But wait a minute. The British first arrived in the Falkland Islands when? 1765. When did the Spanish arrive? 1767. 2 years later. But the Spanish didn't kick the British out, they kicked the French out. They kicked the French out of East Falkland. But the French weren't the only ones here. So while the Spanish had dealt with the French contention to their sovereignty on these islands, the British settlement over at Port Egmont, over on the western side of the Falkland archipelago, remained undefeated. So two European powers remained in the Falklands, Britain and now Spain. Now the two came face to face in 1769 when the Spanish encountered British explorers from Port Egmont on Saunders Island, and then tensions began to rise. But Spain doesn't opt to pay off the British in the way it had paid off its continental neighbor King Louis, because old enemies would deal with things very differently. Spain sends 5 warships and 1,400 troops to evict the British from Port Egmont, and the two European nations almost end up at all-out war. But a diplomatic agreement in 1771 allows Britain to return to Port Egmont, while Spain retained control over Puerto Soledad and the rest of the islands. 3 years later, Britain's finances are feeling the squeeze, and so King George III's Prime Minister, Lord North, decided that the country would withdraw from Port Egmont and leave a plaque in place, asserting the country's undefended claim over the territory. Why was Britain running out of money? Well, Lord North is best known not for his flimsy defense of the Falkland Islands, but for losing the American colonies. It was Lord North who was responsible for the Tea Act of 1773, which led to the Boston Tea Party, and, well, we all know what happened next. So Lord North leaves a plaque in Port Egmont, and the Brits return home. Spain is, for the first time, the only country with a permanent settlement in the Falklands, and it would remain that way until 1811. But now, in an interestingly cyclical turn of history, Spain was running out of money due to overseas wars and brewing independence movements. And now it was Spain's turn to withdraw from the Falkland Islands, abandoning Puerto Soledad and leaving the Falklands uninhabited and ungoverned after 47 feisty years of European power play. Half a century of settlements and evictions, plaque ceremonies and abandonments. By the end of 1811, it was back to the penguins. So why did Argentina invade in 1982? And why are the locals so adamant that they're British? We'll find out after we open the portal and collect our next port of call, Port Stanley. Alrighty, so here we go. This is a photograph of the tender pier in Port Stanley. You can see that as you get out the tender, depending on where the tides are, you step down a couple of steps, and then you're up this floating pontoon, up the ramp, and then the building you can see there is a visitor centre. So worth popping into the visitor centre, and if you're waiting for anybody, any tours or whatnot, then the visitor centre is a good place to wait if it's raining and if it's windy. There's some information inside the visitor centre as well if you want to pick anything up, and there are public toilets near to the yellow building there too. Okay, it is a tender port. Yes, very exciting. We are not the only ship in town either. There are going to be 3 ships in. I'm setting you up for a very realistic day here. There are going to be 3 ships in port. They are all tendering to the same tender platform. And it's a 2-mile tender ride. So 25 minutes really is the minimum it's going to be. You're looking at somewhere between 25 in a good tender to 45 in an unlucky tender. So just so that we can put this into a realistic framework here, it's going to be a slow tender ride morning for 2 reasons. First of all, it's a long journey. Second of all, there are a lot of tenders that are going to be going back and forth, and you can only tie up 1 tender at a time. So keep that in mind with your morning. Please be patient, especially be patient with the team members who have absolutely no control over how these things go. So if you are waiting slightly longer than you would like to be in the ocean bar or in the dining room, please realize it is not the person who's in that room's doing, and so be patient as best you can. We're going to do our best to make it a nice and smooth process by limiting when you can come back to the ship, and so that way it's just a one-way. The tender will unload and come straight back, and we get the next group into that tender, and so we're going to be slipping in as much as we can to get us up alongside the tender platform and get you ashore. Now, the weather tomorrow is also not looking super duper wonderful, which is pretty normal here in the Falkland Islands. It is part of Britain, and so there's going to be a swell as well. The swell's looking about 1 meter. That's nothing you'd feel on this ship, but on a tender it is something you start to feel again. So 1 meter swells. It is going to be raining, and the winds are looking at about 20 knots or so, and then they'll gust higher than that. So there's one other thing I'd like to tell you before we get into our top 10, and that is something that we sometimes do in tender ports like this, where the weather conditions can sometimes lead us to stopping our tender service. If you hear the ship's horn blast for a long period of time, an extended blast on the ship's horn, that is your cue to get back to the ship. Hot-foot it back to the ship, because that's your warning that the tender conditions aren't looking favorable, and so we are imminently going to stop tendering. This has happened before. This happened for those of you on, I think it was the World Cruise on Amsterdam a few years ago, and 300 people slept in the church overnight. And so, yeah, I mean, it was holy, but it was not what they planned. So if you hear it's unlikely, but I want you to know what it means. If you hear the horn, please try and make your way back to the ship as quickly as you can. If we do end up having to get out and you're still there, please don't worry. The church is comfortable. No, don't worry. We will always leave one officer behind who will be responsible for looking after you, making sure that you are comfortable, and making sure that we're in contact with the ship so that we can arrange to pick you up. Because there is only one flight from the Falkland Islands each week, weather dependent. For example, what happened on the Amsterdam a few years ago was that the ship went around to another bay on the other side of the Falklands, and the officer who was on the islands with those who were left behind arranged that everybody would be transported across to the other side, and then we picked people up on the other side. So if it happens, it's an adventure, but hopefully it doesn't happen. Let's get into our top 10. So let's start here. Port Stanley's Christ Church Cathedral is the southernmost Anglican cathedral in the world, which sounds really grand until you see the cathedral. And it's a really modest cathedral. It's beautiful. It was built in 1892. It's a charming red brick building. They've got stunning stained glass windows in there, a cozy, weathered feel, because let's face it, the Falkland winds don't go easy on anything. And outside, you see the whalebone arch made from the jawbones of blue whales. And it's a reminder of the island's whaling past. It's a really popular photo spot, partly because it's striking, but also because, let's be honest, there aren't that many whalebone arches lying around anywhere else. So top photo opportunity. Then you've got the Falkland Islands Museum in Port Stanley, which is a treasure trove of island history, packed into another pretty cozy, welcoming space, housed in the historic Britannia House. It covers everything from shipwrecks, early settlers, right the way through to the 1982 conflict, and the island's wildlife. You're going to find quirky relics like a Victorian kitchen, whaling artifacts. There's even a room dedicated to the radio station that once kept the islanders connected. Outside, you wander around the site, there's an impressive collection of old vehicles, including a goose green tractor. It's a perfect spot here to understand what life is really like in this remote outpost of Britain, past and present. And then if you are particularly interested in 1982 and the Falklands War, the 1982 Liberation Memorial in Stanley is the heart of remembrance for the Falkland Islanders. It stands proudly near the waterfront. It's a granite monument that honours the 255 British servicemen who lost their lives retaking the islands after Argentina's invasion. And at its centre, there is a bronze relief of the islands flanked by the crests of the forces involved. Now, every 14th of June, Liberation Day, as the islanders call it, islanders gather here to lay wreaths, reflect. It's a pretty simple monument. It's powerful. It marks the moment that really changed these islands' history forever. And of course, when we go back over to Argentina, you will see plenty of memorials in Argentina for the same war, but of course, a different name. Gypsy Cove is just 4 miles from Stanley, but this is a perfect quick escape into Falklands wildlife. It's a sheltered bay. It's part of the Cape Pembroke National Nature Reserve, and it is a paradise for bird lovers, with oyster catchers, meadowlarks, even the Falklands' own flightless steamer duck waddling around. I'm not sure how it got its name steamer duck, but I'm intrigued to find out. The real stars, though, are not the ducks, but the Magellanic penguins, also known as jackass penguins, because they bray like donkeys. Anyway, nesting in the burrows along the white sand and the beach, you could well see them there. This is your closest opportunity to go and see some penguins. Keep an eye out also for the occasional sea lion visitor too. And for a little history, you can head out to Ordnance Point, where World War II gun still remains, and it quietly watches over the coastline. Standing out at the easternmost point of the Falklands, Cape Pembroke Lighthouse has been guiding sailors since 1855. Well, the original did, until it was replaced in 1906. So this one that you'll see is from 1906. Black and white cast iron beauty, seen its fair share of storms, standing tall against the wild South Atlantic winds. And though it is no longer operational, it is a fantastic photo spot with sweeping views over that rugged coastline. And nearby there is a memorial to the British ship, the Atlantic Conveyor, which was sunk in the 1982 conflict. A short drive from Stanley, this is a perfect place to soak up the history, sea air, and a bit of Falkland solitude. If you want to come inland a little bit, Mount Longdon isn't just a rugged Falklands peak, it's a battlefield frozen in time. This windswept ridge looming over Stanley was the site of one of the fiercest battles of the 1982 war. Under the cover of darkness, British paratroopers fought grueling hand-to-hand combat to reclaim it from the Argentine forces. And today, remnants of that struggle remain. Trenches, bullet-ridden helmets, war relics just scattered across the rocky terrain. Walking here, you can't help but feel history beneath your boots. It's stark, it's a little haunting, it's deeply moving, and it is a place where the echoes of courage, sacrifice, resilience still linger in the cold Falklands air. Now, just a 10-minute drive from Stanley, Surf Bay is a stunning stretch of white sand. It wouldn't look out of place in the Caribbean until you feel that icy South Atlantic breeze. Now, this place is popular with locals for walking, wildlife spotting, even surfing, which is how it got its name. But it's also one of the most accessible beaches in the Falklands. These gentle dunes just back the shoreline, Magellanic penguins and oyster catchers make an occasional appearance. The water is freezing year-round, but that doesn't stop the occasional brave surfer from taking on the waves. It is a wonderful, wonderful spot for soaking up that wild, untouched beauty of these remote islands. And then if you feel you need to warm up, then you could go to the Falkland Islands distillers. Now, these are putting the remote South Atlantic on the spirits map with their locally crafted gin and vodka. They use pure Falklands water and hand-foraged botanicals, and their gins capture the essence of the islands. You think a wild thyme and diddle-dee berries just giving that crisp, earthy flavor. Their distillery, based in Stanley, offers tastings, they offer tours. You can sip their creations while learning about the challenges of distilling in such an isolated place. And whether you prefer a classic gin and tonic or something a little bit more adventurous, it's a taste of the Falklands that you're not going to find anywhere else. And they open in the afternoon on cruise ship days. Victory Green is a little slice of history on the waterfront, and this grassy stretch, lined with a traditional British red phone box, is home to the famous mizzen mast of the SS Great Britain, which was once the world's largest ship. And a stroll along the green offers a gorgeous harbour view, and if you're lucky, you might spot the governor's ceremonial penguin march on special occasions. Now, this green got its name after World War II. So that's the victory it's commemorating when islanders gathered here to commemorate victory in that war. Today it's a peaceful spot to watch the world and the occasional ship go by steeped in Falklands charm. Final one. Government House in Stanley is a grand slice of Britain in the South Atlantic. It is home to the governor of the Falkland Islands since 1845. Now, this is a Victorian-era mansion. It's white walls, green roof. It's hosted royalty, diplomats, military leaders, and most famously, it played a key role during that 1982 conflict when it was the site of the initial Argentine invasion. Today, it's not open to the public, but you can admire it from the outside, often with a few grazing sheep or a wandering penguin nearby. It is a symbol of resilience, history, quiet Falklands dignity. You can't get as close as this photo anymore. So they have, for security reasons, limited it, but you can see it still from the roadside. Let's put up a map of the highlights. And you can see here that most of the highlights are really very, very close to the ship, or to the tender. And so if you're thinking of staying in Stanley itself, then you've got a great number of options to give you a full day. Or if you're planning on going out into nature, I would pick one of the places and spend the full time out there. A slice of Britain in the South Atlantic. It's complete with a true English village feel, with pubs, bright red telephone boxes, and a village green. So where does Argentina get involved in all this? And why won't they call the islands the Falkland Islands like the rest of the world does? Well, that goes back to Argentina's independence from Spain in 1816. When General Jose de San Martin, often called the liberator of Argentina, led his army of the Andes to the eventual defeat of Spain, the newly created sovereign country of Argentina also laid claim to Spain's former territories in the region, including the Falklands. Now, in 1820, Argentina sends an American privateer called David Jewett to the islands to formally take possession on their behalf. David Jewett really didn't do anything in the Falklands. He didn't build anything. He didn't set up any settlement. He sailed here, he raised the Argentinian flag, and he left. Argentina claimed the islands from no one. Remember, the Spanish had abandoned Puerto Soledad in 1811, and the British had withdrawn from Port Egmont even earlier in 1774, leaving just a plaque. But they left a plaque. And that plaque would have it known to all nations that the Falkland Islands, with this fort, the storehouses, the wharfs, the harbours, the bays, and the creeks thereunto belonging, are the sole right and property of His Most Sacred Majesty George III, King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, Defender of the Faith, etc., etc., etc. Let's be honest, the plaque was long gone by this point. But that didn't stop the British returning in 1833 to reassert control over not just the western point of Saunders Island, but the entire Falklands archipelago. Argentina had started settling the island in 1826, and by 1829 had appointed Louis Vernet as governor of the Falklands, enforcing regulations, particularly on sealing, which Britain and the US opposed. Well, in 1831, Governor Vernet seized 3 US sealing ships, leading to retaliation from the States. The States destroyed Port Louis, and that was followed shortly after by the return of the British on the warship HMS Clio. Captain John Onslow informed the Argentine garrison that they must leave in 24 hours. And they did. There was no war. The small Argentine force had no means to resist, and so withdrew peacefully. Britain re-established active control of the Falkland Islands and has maintained a continuous presence from 1833 onward. Now, Argentina continues to contest this event as an illegal seizure, and this came to a head most notably in 1982, when Argentina sent a task force over to the Falkland Islands to occupy the islands and return them to Argentine control. Now, I'm not going to tell that story today because you're going to have plenty of opportunities to learn about the 1982 Falklands War in Port Stanley tomorrow. But I will say this. Margaret Thatcher continues to split the room at home. Some say she was the best prime minister we've ever had, the most influential leader of Britain in the modern era. Some say that she rescued the country from the brink of collapse. Others, to this day, curse her name. They call her the milk snatcher for her decision to end free school milk for children over the age of 7. They call her the Queen of Mean for her firm stance against the trade unions in the nationwide miners' strike in the mid-80s. And when she died in 2013, they gathered in the streets and sang "Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead" from The Wizard of Oz. Margaret Thatcher was a deeply divisive leader, but not in the Falkland Islands. Here in the Falklands, Lady Thatcher is revered. She's regarded as the liberator of the Falklands. Some islanders go as far as to jokingly call her Saint Margaret. Some people have even suggested renaming Port Stanley as Port Margaret. January the 10th is a public holiday celebrated every year as Margaret Thatcher Day. I don't know why the Falkland Islanders are so defiantly and adamantly British, but they are, whatever the plaque says.